Alright guys, in this video we're going to cover several different applications of taxation. So we're going to look at taxes on labor supply, taxes on savings, taxes on risk taking, taxes on capital gains, transfer taxes, and taxes on property. So first, taxes on labor supply. Another way to say this is on income tax, right? Income is the reward to supplying your labor, and so when you put an income tax in place, you are taxing the labor supply. Now, the labor decision comes down to a trade-off. All labor decisions are a trade-off. They're a trade-off between consumption and leisure. Why is that? You work, you earn income, you are able to spend that income. That's consumption. Of course, there could be more direct ways to do it, but that's the way you and I would mostly conceptualize it. Another way to think about this is if you were a farmer, you grew your own food, made everything that you were living off of there. Obviously, the exact same thing would apply. You work, you get the rewards of your work, that's your consumption. Anytime that you're not working, that's leisure. So, of course, we're grouping a lot of things together. The word leisure is doing a lot of work in that sentence, right? In this idea. But leisure is everything that's not work, that's not consumption. Okay, so let's take a look here. What we're going to do several times throughout this lecture is I'm going to use this same indifference curve budget constraint analysis that we have done before in this class. So there's this preference, right? Indifference curve represents all the preferences between which we're indifferent between the consumption and the leisure. The curve bends like this because we want a mix of the two things. We have to have a lot more leisure if we're all the way on one end, or we have to have a lot more consumption rather than a mix of the two things. That's why we have the shape of the indifference curves that we have. And then the budget constraint represents that trade-off. So in this case, right, we're talking about the trade-off between consumption and leisure. The opportunity cost in this situation is the income that we make from working. So every hour that I work, so here I'm saying that's $12.50. Every hour that I'm working, I'm getting that amount of income. And so if I'm here on this indifference curve, the choice that I make is I want 900 hours of leisure, and it gets me $13,750 worth of consumption. Now, suppose a tax rate is instituted, and that tax rate is 30%, which is actually probably close to the top marginal rate. Again, we've talked about marginal versus average tax rate, so I'm trying to keep this model simple, obviously. And our marginal hour worked here, now the value for that goes down to $8.75. And for simplicity, we'll just apply that all along the budget constraint so that we have a nice straight budget constraint. So the trade-off I'm facing between giving up another hour of leisure to get $12.50 of consumption has now gone down to $8.75 of consumption. So if I spend all my time in leisure, the wage doesn't matter because I'm not working at all. So I get the same intersection with the budget constraint if I spend all my time on leisure. And of course we see the biggest gap over here where we're spending all of our time working, so I'm getting zero leisure. All my time is spent working. If I'm getting $12.50 of consumption, I can get more consumption than if I'm only getting an effective $8.75, right? So we're still earning $12.50, but we're giving that up in taxes, so our consumption is effectively lower. Okay, so that's going to work out. If I hold my number of leisure hours steady at 900, then that would reduce my consumption from 13,750 down to 9,625. Okay, so how do we use our budget constraint and indifference curve model to give an actual analysis of how this will play out when we implement an income tax, a tax on labor supply? Well, it's going to matter. It's going to depend on the substitution and income effects. So we could have this go one of two different ways. Suppose that the substitution effect dominates. We will get this scenario here. So we were initially in this scenario, so I've just recreated all the numbers that you saw before. With that first scenario, we have an indifference curve that gives us 900 hours of leisure. Now, the effective reward for working is reduced. One of the things that we might do in way of application of the substitution effect is substitute away from the thing that's relatively less valuable, right? So the price of leisure has gone down relative to consumption. And so we move from this equilibrium point to this equilibrium point if the substitution effect is larger on net than the income effect. And so we will get more hours of leisure. This is intuitive, right? If you're paid less to work, you would get less work. That's what I'm saying, the substitution effect. And there's this big drop in how much it is that we are able to consume, because not only are we paid less for every hour, because that we find leisure relatively inexpensive, and so the substitution effect being larger, the net effect is that we work even fewer hours, right? So we go from 900 hours to 1,200 hours of leisure, and our consumption drops dramatically. However, it's not the end of the story. It could be the case that the income effect dominates. So I'm saying both of these things are happening at the same time. It could be the case that the income effect dominates. So our effective wage, our real wage after tax, is driven down, and as a consequence, it's effective that our income is constrained. So if the situation is that the income effect dominates the substitution effect, we could actually see a reduction in the number of leisure hours. We work more to try to make up for that lost income to taxes. We're still losing consumption in this case, right? So, in theory, we could move the indifference curve way over here or something, and we could actually increase our consumption by decreasing our leisure dramatically, right? If there's a huge trade-off between consumption and leisure. Of course, you're not going to get there with the way that we've drawn these budget constraints and these indifference curves. You have to have a strong preference towards consumption. And the substitution effect would obviously have to be very small or zero. So we see now a small drop in consumption in exchange for a actual drop. Here we had an increase. Now we've got a drop in the amount of leisure, and so we're facing that trade-off between those two things. Okay, so this is how we would analyze the effect. Now what we're saying is both of these things, so here I've drawn this as if it's substitution effect, but it's not a substitution effect on net, and here I'm saying this is income effect on net. So both of these things are happening at the same time. Which way it is that labor hour supplied will work for the individual household making its labor supply decisions, facing that trade-off between consumption and leisure, is an empirical question. Next, I want to turn to taxes on savings. So first, obviously, what is savings? Savings is the difference between a person's income and consumption. So I'm using a broad definition of savings here. So you could save by putting money into your pillow by this definition. So it's not just, most of us, I think, when we think about saving, we think about putting our money in a bank or an investment. Our next idea is capital income taxation. So how is it that we see taxes on savings happen? The answer to that is capital income taxation. And these are taxes levied on the returns from saving. So the returns from saving would be zero if you stuck it under your pillow. But for most cases, we're thinking about putting this in the bank, putting this in investments, lots of different vehicles for doing that. The taxation on that is what we call capital income taxation. So there's a couple really important pieces to the theory about how we evaluate taxes on savings in economics. The first is an idea called consumption smoothing. So consumption smoothing is altering spending and saving patterns to consume a constant rate in each period. So by period, anytime we use the word period in this class, we're talking about time periods, right? So this could be days, this could be years. So what's an example of consumption smoothing? Suppose you come to visit me in my office next week and I happen to have a whole batch of Snicker bars here on my desk. I give them all to you. I say, here's 7 Snickers. I don't have any use for them. They're all yours. How are you going to consume those? Now, most likely, most of us in this situation will have maybe 1 Snicker bar today and 1 on the next day. So if I give them to you on Monday. So 1 on Monday, 1 on Tuesday, 1 on Wednesday, so forth. Is it exactly how that work? Obviously not. Maybe you have 2 today and 1 tomorrow and none on Wednesday, right? But you're sort of smoothing. You're not eating all 7 of them now, right? So it's a general pattern with individuals that they want to have similar consumption in each different period. Now, how does this play out? Well, obviously there's some very almost trivial ways that this would play out. This might be I want to eat similar amounts of food across the day. I don't want to eat a bunch of food, fill all my calories for a week on Monday, and then fast for 6 or 7 days. Some people do things similar to that, maybe not that extreme. There probably are people that do it that extreme, but in general, most people want their amount of calories consumed over a week smoothed out. We want to have similar budget sizes for a month. We don't want to have January and February and March. We don't want to have different amounts of consumption in each of those months. We want to have roughly the same amount of consumption in each month. Now, there may be notable exceptions to that. Again, this is a heuristic, not an ironclad law. We might consume more in December and as a consequence consume a little bit less in January. But of course, the main way that we're going to think about taxes on savings and consumption smoothing is the application of this idea over the course of years. So we generally want to have similar consumption in different time periods and years. That will be part of why we save. It's why early on, most consumers early on in their life are net borrowers, and then as their earning potential, their income, and their wealth rise, they tend to become more and more net savers, and so they can sort of the point here is that consumption smoothing can work both through saving and through borrowing. Of course, we're interested in taxes on savings. There's not really an application for taxes on borrowing, although I'm sure there are some examples somewhere in the world of that. The other big idea here is what we call intertemporal choice. So these are choices individuals make about how to allocate their consumption over time. Consumption smoothing is an implication of this, right? So what we're saying is we as individuals, as consumers, as economic agents, think about how we want to structure our consumption over time, and we call this intertemporal choice. So let's do a simple model of intertemporal choice just to kind of highlight. I'm going to say there's two periods, right? There's a period in which you work and a period in which you retire. In that period in which you retire, your earnings are zero, right? So this is just a simplified model, right? You can think of these periods as years. Somebody lives for 2 years. In year 1, they work, and in year 2, they retire. They retire going into year 2, and they are retired. And of course, we don't earn any money when we are retired. Now, we have two periods of consumption then, right? One is consumption while we're working, and the one is consumption while we are retired. Savings is very obvious. That's our income, which I should have denoted as Y, so bear with me on that. We're going to use the letter Y for income here. Our savings is our income less however much we consume. So we make $100, we consume 90 of it, we save 10. Now, the important part of this is this idea. Our consumption in our second period, our consumption when we retire, is however much we saved times whatever we get back in interest. So if we save $10 from the previous period, we get 10% interest. Now we have $11 for our consumption in our retirement period. This should fit your intuition. Hopefully all of you that are listening to this are thinking about saving for your retirement, because you fundamentally understand once I stop earning, then I'm only going to be able to consume what it is that I have saved. Okay, these combine to give us the intertemporal budget constraint. This is simply the measurement of the rate at which individuals trade off consumption in one period for another. In the previous section, we talked about the idea between the trade-off between consumption and leisure. That's the application of taxes on labor supply. The implication of taxes on saving is we're facing this trade-off between consumption in one period and the next. Okay, so future consumption versus current consumption. We want to take into that idea of consumption smoothing. Let's think about a very simple case. What if there are just no taxes? We want to think about how this model would work before we add taxes in. If I'm not saving anything in the presence of no taxes, then I'm consuming all of my income in period 1, and I have nothing for consumption in retirement at all. Straightforward. Now, what if I do the exact opposite? I don't consume anything in period 1 while I'm working. I save all of my income. Well, then my consumption during my retirement period is my income plus any interest that I earn from the saving. Okay, this highlights an important idea. Sort of, these are the two end cases, right? Two end cases. That tells us that the relative price, that trade-off that we face, is 1 plus the interest rate. So it's how much we're going to get back in interest. Now, this is going to end up being the slope of the budget constraint because it is the opportunity cost. Anything I consume now is what? That is lost interest earned. This is opportunity cost between goods in the market where we were presenting our first income and substitution effect ideas early on in this class. And a minute ago, we showed this as the opportunity cost between consumption now and consumption later. So how does that work? We were choosing between two goods, and the price was changing. Thus, the relative prices between the two goods were changing. Then that changed how we consumed goods A and goods B early on in this class. That's because the opportunity cost of consuming, I think we used apples and bananas, of an apple is some proportion of a banana based on their relative price. In the model we did a minute ago, our opportunity cost is between consumption and leisure. So if I want to consume more, I have to give up leisure. If I want to engage in leisure, I have to forego some consumption. That's opportunity cost. In this case, we're saying it's interest earned versus consumption in the current period. Let's take a look at this now. It's the same model, right? So now on our axes are two different consumption. I'm saying here's our consumption while we're working. Here's our consumption while we are retired. A person is making an individual choice. Economists model this through indifference curves and budget constraints. So if we consume all of our income, our consumption in the working period is whatever level of income we have. If we save all of it, then it's whatever income we have plus whatever interest we get, and that helps us find this budget constraint, the slope of which is what I said a minute ago, 1 plus r. Now and only now, let's introduce taxes. What happens? Okay, if there's a tax on saving, it doesn't affect you in your working period, right? Because if I consume, I should be careful. It doesn't affect your consumption in the working period if you consume all of your income. So what happens here? Well, we say our income is 100, we save nothing, we completely avoid that taxation. What happens if we save all of our income? We end up over here on this end of the budget constraint. Well, the answer to that is the same idea as before, our income plus our interest less the penalty that we pay for the taxes. So we could see how this would be if this were our income is 100 and our interest rate is 10 and our taxation rate is 1%, then we'd have 100 plus 10% in interest would be our $110 in sort of total after our interest earned, and then of course we pay some taxes on that. And if it's 1%, then we pay $1. We're left with $109 on this end of the budget constraint. Now, let's look at some dynamics here. If in the previous period, in the first period, pre-tax, we gotta be careful. I'm using the word period. In steady state 1, in situation 1, we choose here because we've got this indifference curve and we're faced with this budget constraint. And notice that the same intuition applies. Why is the indifference curve bowed inward like this? This is because we have to have a lot of current consumption to get us to trade off for future consumption. Why? We want to have both current consumption and future consumption. But if you want to force us to have very high level future consumption, we have to have a lot more of it in order to trade off away from having a nice mixture. We'd like to have some now and some later. Notice that this actually is consumption smoothing. So we choose this level of consumption in the first period. And so whatever the distance between consumption in period 1 and our income is, that is our savings rate. And so our consumption in period 2 during our retirement period is that savings times the interest rate. Okay, so everything is straightforward here. Now, the taxes get introduced. I'm saying, what if we hold the amount of consumption in the first period fixed for for the same reason we did that the first time we looked at the labor supply model, then all of that will translate to loss between consumption in the future periods. All of that will translate to loss in consumption in the future periods. Okay, so let's take a look at this again. Exactly what's going to happen. Substitution and income effects. If you increase the taxation on your savings, what has happened? It has become relatively more expensive to consume in your retirement period. It's more expensive to consume in the future because you are paying taxes on the money that you're trying to save for the future. You pay no such penalty when you are in the present period. Okay, so we would substitute. There's a substitute effect. We'll substitute away from our consumption in retirement towards our consumption during our working period in the first period. So that might look like this. We were initially in equilibrium here. The substitution effect dominates. What happens? We see an increase in the amount of consumption that we have in the first period and a reduction in savings, right? Savings went down. The relative price is pushing us towards consumption during our working period, consumption in the first period. Well, what does that look like? Well, our consumption before in the retirement period looked like this, but now we're saving much less, right? We're saving this much. Now we're saving less. So not only do we have less in savings to be multiplied by the interest rate, which we're saying is held fixed, but we also lose this amount. And so there's a big decrease in the amount of consumption that we do in the retirement period. Of course, at the same time, our effective income, our real purchasing power goes down if we face a tax on savings. Unless, of course, we're a person that only consumes in the present. But for anybody that wants to consume during retirement and not starve to death, they also face an income effect. The totality of their purchasing power has gone down effectively because their income has decreased because they're facing higher taxes. Now, suppose that income effect dominates, then we could end up in a situation like so, where I further reduce my consumption during the working period in order to offset the loss that I am facing in the retirement period. So again, it's still going down. It's just going down by much less than it was before. So now S here is actually higher. So S3 is greater than S. We see that here, right? S3 greater than S. And so we will face a smaller change in our retirement period in exchange for consuming less now. So again, the total effect on savings of a tax is dependent on the net effect between the substitution and the income effect. We want to think like economists. We want to think about any changes in price between goods, two different goods in the same period, between consumption and leisure in the same period, between consumption over two different periods. There's three applications that we've experienced so far in this class. We want to think about that being a net effect of the substitution and income effects. Okay, so there is a sort of crossover between these two things. So I want to talk about inflation. It's always a big topic. It's an especially big topic in recent times. Let's introduce an idea called bracket creep. Okay, so there's a special effect in taxation where as inflation pushes nominal wages, so not inflation adjusted, inflation pushes wages up, individuals end up paying higher marginal tax rates because they end up in higher tax brackets, but they don't actually experience an increase in real income. So their purchasing power has not gone up. It's just that the nominal value of their wages has gone up. So the real value is held steady or gone down. The nominal value has gone up. Now all of a sudden they pay higher tax rates, even though their income, once you adjust for inflation, hasn't actually gone up. Now, this of course is only true if tax brackets are nominally indexed. The U.S. government actually fixed this some time ago, and so current income tax brackets are indexed. However, we also want to think about what's happening on the savings side. So nominal interest rates are simply the stated interest rate on a given investment, where real interest rates are the nominal interest rates less the inflation rate. So if I have 2% interest and 1% inflation, then my nominal interest is 2%. My real interest rate, the actual increase in my purchasing power in future periods, is 1%. So this brings us to a very important conclusion. Because taxes are levied on nominal interest rates and not real interest rates, it's actually the case that inflation lowers after-tax real earnings on savings. So inflation hurts savers by causing them to pay relatively high amounts in taxes relative to their real savings. Okay, so notice that it's not just taxation and it's not just inflation, it's the intersection of those two things. So there's a couple other models of saving. So here we've introduced the model of saving for the intertemporal choice, but there are other reasons to save. One of those is precautionary, so we might want to self-insure against risk. We want to save for a rainy day. And the other is self-control. The textbook takes a different approach to this, but I want you to think about this as social norms. So we might save because our mama taught us it was good to save when we were growing up. And the value that we get in that might be in and of itself a good, right? And so I think of myself as a saver, ergo I save, even if it's not really the factor that I'm thinking about saving for consumption in the future, nor am I saving against potential risky events. It's just that I want to be a person who saves money. So there's a couple other alternative models of saving. I won't go into how those interact with what we've done here. More on that in the textbook if you're just super interested in it. Okay, let's take a turn now into taxes on risk taking. I'm going to keep this relatively simple, but investment sort of at its fundamental model in economics is based on expected return. This is simply the return to a successful investment multiplied by the odds of success plus the return on an unsuccessful investment, which might actually be a negative number, multiplied by the odds of failure, which is just 1 minus the odds of success. So this should be relatively straightforward. You're saying, how much do I expect to earn from this investment? Well, if I earn $100 on the investment and there's a 50% chance of success, and if the investment is a failure, then I just get $0, then my expected return is $50. So $100 times 0.5 plus 0 times 0.5 is 50. So just a way to think about this. You've been introduced to this idea in lots of finance classes, I'm sure, so I won't belabor the point. Now, the counterintuitive result of this is that taxing returns can actually raise risk-taking. Let's consider a scenario. Scenario 1, you put your money in a safe investment, you get 0 return, but your money comes back for sure at the end of the time period. Alternatively, you put your money into a risky investment, you get a positive return, it gets taxed by the government, but if you get a negative return, you get to deduct it off of your tax liability. This is called a tax loss offset. So a tax loss offset is deductions of loss from your taxable income. This will actually give rise to the incentive that we prefer risky investments over safe investments because the expected return on the risky investment will be greater than that of the safe investment because of this tax loss offset. So the way that we design taxes on investing really matters because we can actually inadvertently increase risk taking and cause the economy to face much more risk than we would otherwise face if we don't structure our taxes carefully. This actually is a big factor in macroeconomics in recent years. Most tax and monetary policy has favored risk taking over non-risk taking in order to try to grow the economy. That is why we see big recessions and volatility in recent years. So I'll leave off on that because it's beyond the scope of this class. I have the honor of teaching macroeconomics elsewhere, so if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to answer any emails or even have you in class. That's all I want to say about taxes and risk taking. What I want to talk about now is taxes on capital gains. So capital gain is the difference between an asset's purchase price and its sale price. So there's a couple ways to do this. One is what we call taxation on accrual. So this is when taxes are paid in each period on return earned by an asset in that period. So every year that you have it, you pay taxes on whatever earnings you get. This is typically applied to interest earning assets. The other option is taxation on realization. This is when you pay your taxes when an asset is sold and not simply while you hold it. This is what we call capital gains tax. So capital gains tax comes into play between the purchase price and the sale. So that's a tax on realization. Now, there's a couple reasons for capital gains taxation. The first is accrual taxation can be very, very hard to apply because it's difficult to measure the way that value is accrued for assets. How do we measure the value of something that's not being sold? So it's very difficult for many types of assets. Consider the value of a house if you owned one. If you bought a house for $200,000 and the market rate in the area has generally gone up, well, how much would you get if you actually went and sold that house? It's very difficult to say. There are lots of factors: your location, the size of the house, any upgrades you've done to it, the maintenance that you've done on that house, and so on, can change the value of that house over time. This is true with many, many assets where you've not got an interest-bearing asset. It's just an asset that has value. What it is that you've actually gained is not known until you sell it. Now, there's another reason for capital gains tax, though. The second is that even if you did know what the accrual was, say you knew what that value was, if you taxed people on those increases, especially since increases can be sort of volatile, you might have lots of increase in home value one year and a little the next. Well, if you made people pay their accrual taxes, they may not be able to afford doing that because capital assets like this are often very illiquid. Your money is tied up in a large and expensive house, and then you get a big tax bill come due. You may actually have to sell the asset in order to pay your taxes, and this, of course, is changing people's behavior in terms of their investing and saving in a way that we definitely don't want to be doing. Next, I want to turn to transfer taxation. There's three big ideas here. One is transfer tax. A transfer tax is a tax levied on the transfer of assets from one individual to another. You're most likely to have faced this as if you've bought or sold a car from a relative, and perhaps they gave you a low price. So sometimes you can actually have a transfer tax instead of a sales tax in this situation. Another type of transfer tax is a gift tax. This is a tax levied on assets that one individual gifts to another individual. And of course, the estate tax, which is a tax levied on the assets of a deceased individual and what they bequeath to another individual. So what's really interesting about this is a consideration of why or why not would we do these kind of transfer taxes, especially when they are applied to wealth. Now, there's a couple arguments laid out for this. The one that we've discussed, tax fairness. If you believe that progressive taxation is important for fairness, one effective way to do that is to tax wealth. So we've discussed the problems with progressive taxation compared to benefit and horizontal equity. If you're advocating for achieving vertical equity in taxation by making a tax progressive, a very effective way to do that is through estate taxes or wealth taxes. Another argument that sometimes gets used in favor of this is this combats the concentration of wealth. So one of the things that was an argument over a long time period in economics is the argument between communism and capitalism. And in this, we discussed the knowledge problem earlier on in this class, but a new type of concern that has been raised, and I say new, maybe more that it's resurfaced than it's ever truly been new, is that as opposed to an argument that communism would raise, because communism is also obviously often about concentration, capitalism has a potential problem wherein it concentrates wealth and we actually see negative effects. Now, I want to be very careful here. We want to distinguish between the idea of free markets, which are important to advocate for, and capitalism, which is a economic system, right? Capitalism is often goes hand in hand with free markets, but they are not the same thing. One of the things that capitalism might do is concentrate wealth. might concentrate wealth, and it might do that in part by allowing individuals who have large stocks of capital and wealth to pass that on between generations. Now, anytime somebody would make this kind of argument, they will often sort of get labeled as somebody who's advocating for socialism or communism. But I do want to point out there are a couple of political approaches that are relatively conservative and are not on the progressive side of the spectrum. And these are distributism and agrarianism. So distributism is an idea that arises from Catholic social teaching that argues that one of the key components of a society should be that the productive elements of society are somewhat evenly distributed among households. Notice that this is different than communism, where communism uses the government as an extension of the people to have actual public ownership of firms and operate in this manner. And in that way, you might still get the similar concentration of capital. Distributism is instead arguing that we need to not have large firms that concentrate capital heavily, and instead have many small firms that are associated with individual households. That gives us a fairer, better societal outcome. Not advocating for this, I just want to make sure that everyone sort of has a sense of what the philosophical and political spectrums are like out there. Distributism has a lot of other issues, and many of the best thinkers in distributism, G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, are the two most important thinkers in this. Were not especially sharp on their economics, so there's lots of economic considerations, and I would say most of those apply in their policy prescriptions from distributism as opposed to their sort of fundamental idea. The other idea is agrarianism, and so agrarianism is sort of similar in some sense, and this is actually has a huge tradition in American roots, and so many of the lesser known founding fathers, John Taylor of Caroline would be an example of this, would advocate for agrarianism and argue for free markets with the absence of concentration of capitalism. Now, is it the case that a wealth or estate tax is something that distributists or agrarians would argue for? I do not know, and I sort of doubt it. Now, the last one, and one that I want to mention but I find to be thoroughly unconvincing, is the motivation of inheritors. So one reason that advocates will say we should tax wealth is because those who inherit large estates are often not motivated to work hard to maintain the estate, etc. And of course, this presumes to the state that they have the ability to judge the work ethic and motivation of individuals in a way, in a situation where it doesn't necessarily involve the state. So I find that to be a not very convincing argument. Now, let's take a turn and look at arguments against wealth taxes. One common argument is simply that death taxes are cruel. Somebody died and now the government is being opportunist and jumps in and takes this as an opportunity to levy more in taxes. It's just a societal norm that we're often uncomfortable with. A second argument is that estate taxes are double taxation. Estate taxes are double taxation. So we've already paid taxes in the income that we got to earn it, and then you are again taxed when you try to bequeath it. So the outcome is criticized on two grounds. The first is horizontal equity. So why should those paying estate taxes be taxed an extra time on their income, right? So those horizontal equity people in the same situation should be taxed similarly. So this seems to fail on that test. And then second is efficiency, right? So if you are taxing heavily on estates, it reduces the incentive to save. So we actually distort saving decisions by having an estate tax. Now, the book raises several sort of counter arguments to this. The first is double taxation is a pervasive feature of the tax system, right? So you take after tax income and then you buy something, you pay a savings tax, and that savings, that purchase, faced other types of taxation in there. And so there's just taxation from every angle. I find this to be very poor thinking, right? We're saying double taxation is bad. Well, there's double taxation everywhere, so why should we avoid it in wealth taxes? This is like saying we should not kick puppy dogs, and then I argue, no, we should continue to kick puppy dogs because puppy dogs elsewhere in the world are being kicked. It's just a stupid argument. But I imagine it's one that you'll be exposed to if you ever get into reading about these kind of arguments. They're also arguing that because of income and substitution effects, double taxation doesn't necessarily reduce savings. Remember that on the margin, effects get stronger, so I suspect the empirical evidence on this doesn't line up. And then the final sort of counter argument here is that there's a step up in the capital gains basis at death, right? So your labor income is taxed twice. Once when earned and once when taxed at death, but then other taxable accrued income is also taxed twice. Capital gains income, though, is only taxed once if it's applied at the estate tax, at the death tax. Okay. The third argument against wealth taxes, estate taxes, is administrative difficulties. Right, so you have that same accrual problem that we talked about before, where an estate could be forced to sell assets in order to pay a death tax. That's definitely a thing we want to avoid, but you just kind of have general problems with being able to administer this taxation. Finally, there's compliance and fairness, right? And this is, relatively straightforward. If we're taxing high-value estates, then the higher the value of the estate, the easier it is for it to avoid estate and death taxes. Now, this is because of things like trusts and other perfectly proper and legal ways to get around it. A common tactic that you'll see, for example, Bill Gates uses is to have a foundation, and then instead of actually passing down his wealth and exposing it to lots and lots of death or estate taxes in the future, his children are simply leaders in the Bill Gates, I think it's Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and so they gain a lot of benefit from that, and we're not seeing any exposure to the death or estate taxes in the Gates Foundation. Finally, I want to talk about property taxes. So property tax is a tax levied on the value of real estate, including the value of land and structures on that land. So there's two big ideas here. One is you have to assess the value of the property. It's very hard if it's not sold. And so various systems have arisen to sort of estimate what the market prices of things are. This is similar again to that accrual versus realization problem from before. The other component of a property tax is not just the rate at which the property is taxed, but what we call the assessment ratio. The assessment ratio is the proportion of the property that ends up being subject to taxation. So in some places, maybe only half of the property value is subject to taxation. So if you have a $200,000 property, 50% assessment ratio and a 10% tax, then only 100,000 of the 200,000 is taxable, and then we apply a 10% tax. So there's $10,000 in taxes applied. And we see examples all the way from low single digits all the way up to 100% assessment ratios. So there's a lot of variation at the state level in particular, but also at the local level in assessment ratios. So, of course, the big question in property taxation is tax incidence. Who bears taxes on property? I want to bring up a very important point, which is who it is that bears a tax burden is not determined by the statutory nature of the tax. Right, so just because we level the tax on one thing doesn't mean that's who pays it effectively. And so one of the biggest lessons we can learn in this class is tax incidence. There are three views on how to evaluate property taxes. I think all three are valid and have a lot to add to the conversation, so I'm going to break them down. These are the traditional view, the capital gains view, and the benefits view. The capital gains view is sort of also considered the new view. And then we've mentioned TIBU sorting in passing. We've got a whole section on it later on in this class, so I'm gonna be somewhat brief in this lecture here. So first, the traditional view. Traditional view is the partial equilibrium view. So if you should remember that phrasing from our tax incidence lecture. And it focuses on an important fact of property taxation, and that is property taxes levied both on the land and the structures on the land. Now, land is inelastic in supply, ergo, landowners bear the tax. The other thing that's being taxed is structures. Structures are elastic in supply, at least relative to land, and therefore taxes levied on structures are actually borne partially by each party, both people that want to buy or rent houses and people that own and supply houses. So if we see a tax and it's reducing the supply, we'll then see our normal tax incident situation in which the price does rise, but only by partially the amount of the tax, and so therefore the amount that the supplier is getting in the new price is partially offset by the tax that they face, or I'm sorry, the other way around, the tax that they end up paying is partially offset by the increase in prices that they receive. The capital gains view, on the other hand, is a general equilibrium approach, and so property taxes drive capital out of the jurisdictions. This is what I mean by general equilibrium. We don't want to just look at the markets for land and houses and the people that are wanting to buy and consume those. Instead, we want to look at a situation where we consider other markets, other jurisdictions. So the upshot is, if you raise property taxes, you will drive capital out of the jurisdiction. This is straightforward, right? If you tax something, you get less of it. And so in this situation, you are taxing structures, and so home builders build more houses in other jurisdictions that are near and accessible to them and fewer in yours. And this will actually cause the total of the returns to capital to fall. Let me work a very simple example. So we want to be a little bit careful. I'm just using a numerical example to highlight this. Suppose in period 1, the return on housing in A is 10. Now, the returns to capital in this little model that I'm presenting here are equalized across districts. I'm just saying capital can move around to take advantage of its highest return, right? And there's no taxation. Then we're going to see that because the return in A minus the taxes have to be equal to the return in area B, we're going to see that they're going to end up being the same. The return to capital in A is going to be 10%. The return to capital in B is also going to be 10%. Okay, but suppose in period 2, the return in A is still 10%, but there's a 2% tax introduced. Well, now capital will be driven out. So some firms that were in A because they were getting 10% return, but now their effective rate of return is lowered by 2%, so they're getting 8% return in A, means that they will move away from A to try to find opportunities elsewhere in other places. Well, they don't have to get 10% in order to move anymore. They only have to get 8%, because 8% non-taxed is the same as 10% facing the tax, meaning that the return in the whole area will actually drop down to 8%. Suppose in period 3, area A raised their taxes by 1%, and so we actually see a situation where the effective rate of return is now 7%. Capital will move out into nearby jurisdictions, and the return will fall. Why is that? Well, as we have more capital in an area, the marginal return of that will fall. Straightforward, all the market ideas that we've talked about before in this class. The upshot of that is, because the returns to capital are falling, because of this force, we see that the owners of capital end up being the ones bear the burden of the tax. We sort of have a slightly different outcome from the traditional view. Finally, we've got the benefits view. And in the benefits view, property taxes finance the local government, right? So, we've talked about this when we introduced taxes in this class, right? Property taxes are a common local government tool. Now, the textbook argues, and I think there's reason to believe this, that local government services are valued more by homeowners than others, and there's at least a higher commitment to an area for a homeowner than a renter. So, therefore, property taxes function as something of a user fee, right, which we've introduced this idea before in this class. We generally think of that as a good idea because it matches the burden of taxation to those who benefit. Now, the textbook says Therefore, it is a price set by local government to finance optimal level of public goods. I think they've got the idea there, right? You're setting the user fee in a way that helps you determine what level of public goods, but I find this to be an extremely sloppy use of the word price, because this is not a price. The price arises from a market. This is not a market. This is a government levied tax rate. So I understand why they're saying price. They're saying price in the sense of that is what the homeowners end up paying. But at the end of the day, it's not a price, and so we really want to use this idea of a fee. So it's a fee set by local government in order to finance whatever level of public goods. Now, they're also saying it's optimal. We haven't introduced TBU sorting just yet, but suffice to say that this is, again, not a market outcome, so we won't have any guarantee that it will be optimal. It just is setting up what that level is.